Hello, and welcome back to David Starkey Talks. I'm sorry there's been a bit of a longer gap than there should have been, but I have been very busy in the real rather than the virtual world. Some of you may have seen the coverage which I did of the Jubilee for GB News, where in fact I am going to be being given a regular role very shortly. You may have seen my Jubilee coverage with Alistair Stewart, which received, dare one say, acclaim. One of the first really good reviews I think that GB News has actually received. So there was that, and then, as some of you will have spotted from the videos, I spent a week at the Danube Institute in Budapest and found it an extraordinarily interesting and in some ways very moving experience, actually very challenging one in my debates with an American constitutionalist, which was John Fontaine, which was, how can one put it, exciting. One realises what it is like to encounter a completely different and, I felt, very rigid mindset. No doubt he felt mine was very different and very rigid too. So there's been that. There have been lots of big speaking events, some of which we were able to film. Unfortunately, rather a lot that we weren't in London. And finally, an extraordinary event which we certainly weren't able to film. In fact, possibly the most extraordinary experience I've had since I was a sixth former. When I was a sixth former, I think I may have talked about this, I played the part of Thomas Becket in Murder in the Cathedral, and I played it really rather well, and we did so well that we removed it from the school hall to Kendal Parish Church, which is this vast sort of 5-aisle wide structure. Performed from the pulpit and all the rest of it, and my English master, Edmund Mounsey, who was under his Quakerism very sharp indeed, looked at me as I was preening myself on this mock religious agony, and wagged a finger at me and said, "Starkey, don't get ideas. You would have made a very good bad cardinal." So there we are. So, but the point of telling that story is now that for the first time in my life since then, I experienced another pulpit, and actually an even bigger one, namely the nave pulpit of Westminster Abbey, where I spoke on the extraordinary occasion of the Burghley 500, the celebrations to mark the 500th anniversary of the birth of William Cecil, Elizabeth I's First Minister, and his life and his legacy. Speaking to 1,500 people in Westminster Abbey is, well, a challenge, and maybe you will think I've let you down, but I did actually have a word-for-word script. The problem, of course, with a word-for-word script, you can't actually look at the audience, so I had no real idea how they were reacting to me, but they seemed to be fairly pleased. Anyway, all of which is by way of preface to say that as well as doing all of those things, I've actually been thinking quite a lot, and I'm hoping to present you with the fruits of those thoughts in this video. We've heard a lot. I talked about the Jubilee. We've heard a lot in the interim from Prince Charles and from Prince William. I'm really wondering whether the English monarchy is going to begin with William the Conqueror and finish with William the Woke. But anyway, we've been hearing a lot from both William and Charles about of slavery, empire, and from many other people arguing that slavery needs to be a compulsory element in the history curriculum, the only other one being, incidentally, the Holocaust, and that the two should be taught together. Now, one possible reaction to all of this is to shrug one's shoulders and say, basically, how silly. All this was a long time ago. Britain, unlike most other countries, actually came to terms with its past voluntarily and at the time, rather than, for example, like Germany with the Nazis, waiting until it was conquered and doing it afterwards and very inadequately and moving on as quickly as it possibly could. But I think on reflection, that's the position I would have adopted until very recently. On reflection, I think I'm wrong. completely wrong. I think that what is being said about the centrality of the empire, which is very much bigger than slavery, but clearly encompasses slavery, is absolutely spot on, and that we should seriously do something about it. So, first of all, I would like to make a characteristically modest proposition. I would like to reinstate Empire Day, the celebration of the British Empire, but also as an opportunity to think about it, and to think about it not simply how it came about, its extraordinary scale and extent, but its legacy, not simply for Britain, not simply for the immigrants to Britain, but for the entire world. Empire Day, those of you who are my sort of age can actually remember the tail end of it in the 50s and the 60s, but it really got going in the Edwardian period, in the aftermath of the death of Queen Victoria, and it was celebrated on Victoria's birthday, her real birthday, which there wasn't an official birthday because hers took place at a reasonably clement period of the year. It took place on the 24th of May, and the 24th of May was instituted as Empire Day, which was, of course, entirely appropriate as the formal coming into existence of the British Empire was when Disraeli is responsible for the formal creation by parliamentary process of Victoria as Empress of India, and the adoption of the imperial title alongside the title of King or Queen of the United Kingdom, Empress of India, and so on and so on. So, and the great apogee of empire, the height of empire in terms of both extent and in many ways power, I think, is that immediate post-Victorian period, and it's reflected in the vast scale of the rebuilding of London to mark again Victoria's death. Everything that we saw in the Jubilee, everything that I sat and watched in the Jubilee from, I've now forgotten which one of the gates it was it Australia Gate, but all the great gates with those magnificent gilt wrought iron gates round the great roundabout in front of Buckingham Palace, they're all built at this period. The Mall is laid out at this period. Admiralty Arch is laid out and designed, and the front of Buckingham Palace, which of course presided over the whole thing, was, when it wasn't actually obscured by the stage for the pop concert and the pageant, that extraordinary front of Buckingham Palace literally glued on, pinned on in the summer of 1913, just before the First World War, from the monies that were left over from this national monument to Victoria, of course, which is crowned by the great statue of Victoria sitting on her huge marble plinth in the centre of that roundabout, and with the fountains dribbling, flowing water below. So the imperial apogee, which is represented there in the imperial buildings in Cardiff, the invention of a capital for Wales. Similarly, in the subsequent decade, the extraordinary, the wonderful Lutyens buildings of the new capital, the New Delhi capital of the Indian Empire, which was approaching completion exactly at the moment that the empire was dissolved and the British handed things over rather catastrophically in terms of the actual processes of handover back to the Indians in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. So I would like to revive Empire Day. A day to commemorate, a day to remember, a day to assess. But I would like to do something else. I would like seriously to reconstruct the school history programme, and probably even the bulk of the university undergraduate history programme, round the idea of empire. This is not, it is the precise opposite, of course, of Little Englandism. The empire is the moment at which England reaches out to the world and then comes back again. It's the moment at which the world is made one. In other words, the British Empire And we do need just to pause and think why I am prepared to advance this notion and to advance it very seriously. The British Empire is not simply, as people have been arguing, the most important event in British history. It is the most important event in world history. It is the foundation of the globalized world that we live in, whose extraordinary pressures we are now seeing on every side, in which an action in the Ukraine can destabilize our prices, can destabilize currencies, can induce famine in Africa and so on. This extraordinary globalized world. We invented it. The British Empire created it. It transformed the world. We are all living in it. So I think taking the idea of empire as the central thread in first English and then British history, empire is about much, much more than the relations of white and black. It's vastly more important than debates about racism and all the rest of it. It's fundamentally the debate about the destiny of human civilization. But it's a debate. And what I will try and do at the various stages in that debate is highlight how all sorts of assumptions, not simply about history, but very much about our present, are raised by this approach, this kind of lens. It's a combination, isn't it, of lens. It's a microscope sometimes, it's a telescope sometimes, it's a kind of panning dish, great radio telescope panning across the universe of history on other occasions. So let's actually begin. But where should we begin? Well, of course, we begin indeed with an empire, but not the British Empire, the Roman Empire. The first time that, apart from all the mysticism and often nonsense, I think, about Stonehenge, that we really know about these islands is the time of their conquest and their absorption into the Roman Empire. So we will begin with an idea of empire. And remember, because of the enormous prestige of Roman culture, the enduring importance of Latin, the way in which it remains the prime language of intellectual debate and communication effectively until the 19th century, it means that empire isn't this sort of intrusion. It's not this thing that sort of rather wickedly comes in. It means it's the intellectual water. We are imperial fish. We swim in the water of empires, beginning particularly, of course, there were lots of empires before Rome. The Roman Empire, which incidentally grows under the Republic. Under the Republic, the Roman Empire advances, as most empires do, by conquering other people's empires. So the work of accretion is indeed, it's a work of accretion. Other people have done the Alexander the Great and so on, and whatever. They'd done the hard work of pre-imperial conquest, and then the remains, the shadows of their empires are conquered by Rome, and this vast conglomerate is made. But of course, what is Britain in that? Well, Britain isn't what it becomes in the British Empire. It's not the capital, it's not the master, it's a remote and fringe province, one of the last to be conquered and one of the first to leave the empire. So that then raises all sorts of questions, doesn't it? That we're then, as I said, we're last in and first out. We're also, of course, one of the areas where it would appear the Roman conquest left fewest long-term traces. Yes, there are lots of archaeological traces, but there is no direct trace in our language, no direct trace in our institutions, even very little trace in where people live. Yes, a few Roman cities like Lincoln and London survive, but the overwhelming majority of centres of Roman occupation did not remain continuous centres of occupation thereafter. So, we're part of an empire to begin with, a fringe empire, or rather a fringe of that empire, a lately conquered and quickly let go province. That of course then raises an interesting question, doesn't it? The whole business of, not what we regularly look at, the growth of empires, but their decline, A Decline and Fall, to use the famous title of the work by Edward Gibbon, written at the height of the British Empire in the 18th century, but contemplating the fall of the Roman Empire. He was inspired to write it as he sat in the Forum in Rome, looking at the ruins of Rome and watching the sort of pattering feet of the friars, of Catholic friars, as they wandered over these sites of greatness, and of course effectively presenting the argument that Rome fell not because it was conquered from without, but from moral decay within and daring. Because of course he was a famous atheist, much denounced by his contemporary Dr. Johnson, declaring in effect that it was the moral revolution of Christianity which destroyed Rome. Something for us to think about, because clearly you could construct a very good argument that, leaping right to the end of the story that I'm just beginning now, that woke represents a perverted form of Christianity. He shall put down the mighty from their seats and exalt them of low degree. Well, woke can be seen as that, you know. So you'd immediately have that big question to start off with. What destroys empires? Because Britain was the site of that great retreat from Rome in 410 under Honorius, the abandonment of Britain and everything that follows. Well, what does follow? Well, as we all know, two things happen. We get, and again there's a big debate on this, isn't there? What happens with Rome when Rome takes Britain? Well, it's a conquest, or is it an immigration? What happens when the Anglo-Saxons, whatever they are and whoever they are, and there's extensive debate, but there's sort of a consensus on it. What happens when the Anglo-Saxons take over? Is it a conquest, or is it an immigration, or the Danes and later on the Normans? Isn't it interesting that because there's suddenly been an interest in these movements with the post-war, and particularly the post-1990s, enormous levels of immigration to Britain, unprecedented in their numbers and scale and the proportions of the population, there's been an attempt, hasn't there, saying, well, actually, we've always been a nation of immigrants. People sort of arriving, you know, the equivalent of little boats landing on Dover Beach and whatever. But as far as we can tell, the Anglo-Saxons, certainly the Romans we actually know, didn't sort of even ask permission or even evade permission to land. They conquered. They took over. They destroyed. They replaced. So do we actually need a different model of Britain? These early stages of Britain's history, which of course suddenly then becomes very disturbing, doesn't it? Not waves of immigrants that are sort of absorbed, but wave after wave of conquerors who take over, destroy, transform, decapitate the native culture, destroy the native language, destroy the native ruling class. We can debate those issues more fully when we actually come to the Norman conquest itself. But of course, the idea of empire, although the Roman Empire in the West falls in the middle of the 5th century, that doesn't mean that the idea of empire disappears. Of course it doesn't. The Eastern Empire, with its capital in Byzantium, in Constantinople, continues, of course, as a major power. Similarly, the idea of empire is present, I think, in two ways. It's very much present, of course, and we do tend to forget this. A very large part, virtually the entire Mediterranean part, with the exception of Italy itself and southern France, of the Western Empire, was very quickly taken over by another empire, the Islamic Empire, the Abbasid Caliphate. So again, Islam conquers the empty shell of Rome. It's one empire, usually a very small group taking over another empire. So there is that empire. But much more importantly, from direct cultural point of view in Western Europe, the idea of empire never ever goes away. And it's Rome rests as a kind of collective memory, awareness of a great civilization which fell and which for a very, very long time those of us who were its successors knew, frankly, that they did not match. You still go to Rome, you look at the scale of the Colosseum, you look at the scale of the Pantheon, and you're dwarfed, and you're impressed. And that's now, with all the resources we have, the processes of technological transformation. Can you imagine what those Anglo-Saxon immigrants or conquerors or whatever it was thought when they contemplated, say, the Roman baths in Bath, which were originally roofed, of course, like the baths of Caracalla? Well, if we look at the actual comments of people like Bede, the Anglo-Saxon historian, remember the idea of the Anglo-Saxon church. The English church is invented before the actual existence of a single English state. But there Bede talks about the sense that these buildings were the work of giants. They could barely believe that they were the creation of humans. So great was the gap between that civilization and what they brought. But this idea of empire never goes away, and from 800 onwards, of course, it is literally revived by Charlemagne, with Charlemagne's coronation by the Pope, and from that point onwards, there is a new, what's commonly called the Holy Roman Empire, which comes to be based primarily in Germany and is a dominant power of the Middle Ages. With England, which at this point is to begin with a series of warring Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and then eventually you get a union of them in the post-Alfred period, the creation by the late Anglo-Saxon period, and of course with yet another semi-conquest by the Danes, you get the creation of what appears to be a remarkable, almost unitary state in England, with more or less its present frontiers, something quite extraordinary. But then, of course, what is it? How does it relate to the England? How does it relate to this new revived empire, Holy Roman Empire? How does it relate to the other power, which itself incorporates so much of the world of Rome, which is, of course, the papacy? The papacy also based in Rome, with the popes adopting much of the ceremony, much of the costume, much of the actual language of imperial power, of course, not exercising it directly so much by armies, but by the processes of culture, by the processes of law, by the processes of taxation, by the control of minds and the faith, and so on. So, Anglo-Saxon England, in a kind of, it seems, a sort of semi-detached relationship. It is, of course, very, very remote from this, from those centres either in continental Europe, either the Holy Roman Empire, and still more remote from Rome. Of course, it knows Latin, but it's unusual in that it uses its own language. It uses Anglo-Saxon, which is a Germanic dialect, but like German itself, is a complex language with case endings, with declinations of nouns and conjugations of verbs and all that sort of thing. A complex written language, but it uses Anglo-Saxon to write about itself, to administer itself. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is in Anglo-Saxon, it's not in Latin, and so on. And again, this remarkably tensile structure with, as I said, that it is a sort of unified state, but also it's got this structure of the counties, which themselves are both, as it were, units of local power, but participants in the national structure. It gives it a highly tensile. They're called shires at this point. County is the later word. So this sort of slight, I think, semi-detached to the broader post-imperial European structures. And then, of course, well, what happens? Well, it's conquered. It's conquered in the Norman Conquest, and we really can't talk about the Normans as immigrants. The Norman Conquest is an extraordinary, we do need to grasp this point. It is not, as it were, a year in Provence with sort of extra violence. On the contrary, it is one of the most brutal, decapitating conquests of a people ever carried out. I want to repeat that. It's one of the most brutal conquests of a people ever carried out. And when Prince Charles talks of slavery, let me give his words right, as the most painful period of our history, doesn't he really need to reflect that the Norman Conquest didn't take place in the transatlantic, it didn't take place in Caribbean islands. The Norman Conquest took place here. It enslaved not people who'd already been enslaved by their conquering Africans, re-enslaved by Arab slave traders and taken across the Atlantic. It enslaved a free people. It deliberately destroyed their language, it destroyed their customs, it destroyed their ruling class, it changed their places of occupation, it transformed their life, their architecture. To be an Anglo-Saxon in Norman England was to be a semi-slave by definition. You were an inferior creature. It is also, as one can gently remind Prince Charles and Prince William, it is the direct origin of their families' role in England. It is the beginning of the English monarchy, which is why we count our kings from William the Conqueror. Now, again, let's not get too... I've just been presenting the truth. But let's not get too pious about that truth. It was a rule, and this is why I was making that point about conquest. It is a rule of warfare in the Middle Ages that, and indeed, right through to the present, look at what we do in Nazi Germany, that if you conquer a country absolutely, if you have unconditional surrender, existing systems of law, rights, everything else are simply in abeyance or are abolished. And William the Conqueror simply reinvents, recreates England as he wants and as he can get away with. So, we have this extraordinary transformation. From it comes something very remarkable in the process of time. You get, I was talking about one culture being a master race culture, the French or the Normans, the other an Übermenschen, an Untermenschen, a kind of underground people, a culture of the Anglo-Saxons. Well, the two in the processes of the Middle Ages do fuse, and similarly the two languages do fuse. We've talked about this before by the end of the 14th century with Chaucer and so on. And they create something, I think, very remarkable. A language which has enough of the abstract content of Latin to make it highly functioning, but is not Latinate in structure. There are then all sorts of other questions that we need to be asking. It's been argued that more survives the Norman conquest of Anglo-Saxon England than I've sort of suggested. And one of the things that is very strongly said to survive is an idea of individualism. It's the argument of Alan Macfarlane's remarkable book, The Origins of English Individualism. I've referred to it before. It's something that has profoundly influenced me and my own thoughts on these matters. But it's also, it's something else. It's very much to do with family structure. Anglo-Saxon family structure seems comparatively weak, and it is to be argued that it is that relative weakness of family structure which allows for notions of individualism, which of course accounts for both the notions of Anglo-Saxon law, of English law and rights and so on, because again, one of the remarkable features of this hybrid state and this hybrid culture which emerges in England after the Norman Conquest is that you don't simply develop this odd language called English, you develop the only system of law, that's English common law, that in its sophistication, its complexity, the way it's taught, its rootedness in the professional class, its self-confidence, the only system of law that rivals Roman law and yet of course operates in a radically different fashion. The one from the edicts of the emperors coming down, codified and so on, the other essentially case decisions coming up, the one deductive, the Roman law deductive, English law emphatically inductive, coming up from the bottom. Now, so we've wandered rather a long way from empire, but no, we actually haven't. Of course, whilst all this is happening, this creation of an odd culture in Britain, and particularly, especially in England, though also, again, it's important to acknowledge this fact, something very, very similar happening in southern Scotland, which is not remotely Celtic, although it's not ruled from London. Very much the same patterns of changes seem to take place there. You know, the development of a very similar language, Scots as opposed to English, and very similar institutions of state having much the same kind of names, and so on. But whilst all that's going on, you do of course have other notions of empire developing. They're influenced, I think, by the Roman model, but they're of different type and scale. Even under the Anglo-Saxons, there was a notion of the Empire of Britain. This was the idea of the Bretwaldership, the idea that England, clearly, and the coronation of Edgar, which can be argued as the moment at which an idea of England really comes into full existence, but the coronation of Edgar is followed by the symbolic rowing of Edgar in the Dee by tributary kinglets of the Celtic world. In other words, that he is not simply King of England, he is an overlord of Britain, so a sort of general shadowy idea of a British empire, but that's to say an empire of Britain. That's one. That's a very important notion. You see it resurfacing with Edward I's programmes of conquest, the successful conquest of Wales, the narrow failure to conquer Scotland, and the idea of a British empire revived again very much by Henry VIII, much less successfully than by Edward and so on, and arguably you could say by Oliver Cromwell, who is the only person successfully to have conquered with catastrophic consequences, especially in Ireland, the only person actually to have conquered the whole of the British Isles. So there's that notion of an empire of Britain, a British empire in that sense of the word. And then, of course, there's another sense of empire, which is an empire that goes across the Channel. Following the Norman Conquest, the whole articulation of English politics is shifted, is reorientated. In the Anglo-Saxon period, the main lines of communication are from, well, they're back home, aren't they? They're back to Scandinavia, they're back to the North German coast and so on. In other words, going across the North Sea. Those routes remain very important in terms of trade, but the main political route, the thing that exploits the fact that we are an island with the Norman Conquest, is the turning to the south. And here again, as I've emphasised in other videos, what we must remember is that the sea at this point isn't a barrier. The Channel is a means of communication, and for most of the Middle Ages, from the Norman Conquest onwards, England is actually part of some sort of cross-channel structure. First, the Angevin Empire, which collapses in the reign of King John, and then the extraordinary Plantagenet empires, particularly Edward III and Henry V. And Henry V coming within a whisker of a joint monarchy of England and France. And it's at that point that the formal notion of the imperial pretensions of the English crown are established, and you have a crown, and you can see it very clearly on Henry's tomb at Westminster Abbey. You will see it on images of his son, the very unwarlike Henry VI, and so on, and the Tudors and whatever thereafter. You get a crown with a new characteristic, essentially imperial form, which is the band of the crown that goes round there alternates symbols of England and France, the cross pate for England, the fleur-de-lis of France, and to symbolise the fact that this is an empire, it's closed, it's got arches going across the top, which echoes the mitre-like crown of the Holy Roman Empire, the so-called closed or the imperial crown, and you get from this point onwards a steady elevation of the royal title. It's up to this point it's Your Grace, then it becomes Highness, and then by the end of Henry VII, and emphatically under Henry VIII, it becomes Majesty. Well, this all, as you see, we're getting back, by a very odd route, we're actually getting back to, well, Roman Latin, aren't we? What is majesty? Well, it's majestas. It is the majesty of the Roman people, the sovereignty, the sovereign power, the absolute power of the Roman people, which comes finally with the collapse of the Republic to be embodied first in Prince, the Principate, Augustus, and then more formally, more absolutely and irreversibly in the Emperor. So we're getting back to Romanness. Of course, the Romanness comes back in a very, very large way, doesn't it? With the Renaissance itself. The Renaissance is essentially bringing back into the mainstream of Western European thought, of the undiluted authentic thought of Greece and particularly of Rome. And remember, we get confused, don't we, because Roman history divides itself around Caesar, the famous struggles of Caesar's murder, assassination, the rise of Augustus and whatever. It divides itself into the Republic and into the Empire. But of course, the Republic had become a great empire. It's Caesar himself, you know, who accomplishes the conquest of Gaul. That you've already got Egypt just about falling, and Egypt conquered, and so on. And in the immediate aftermath of all of these events, the thing, you know, that forms the basis of Shakespeare's great play of Antony and Cleopatra, and so on. But all of these ideas, the ideas about Romanness, the ideas about power, the idea about the morality of the state, the belief in the destiny of Rome, the belief in the state's ability to demand the service of the citizen. All of these things come flooding back. I mean, they'd never entirely gone away, but they come back in a much more explicit form. So what I think we need to understand is that from the 15th and the 16th century onwards, the idea of empire is absolutely central to the education of everybody who matters. It's not, you know, it's not a strange notion. It is something which is simply there. It is integral to their way of thinking, the language they use, and so on. And it works itself out in a whole series of different ways. So the Renaissance then is the moment at which you get a kind of explicit, how can we call this, re-imperialization of our experience. Now, this again, we need to put this now into the bigger context. We're roughly now, aren't we, at the beginning of the 16th century. We're at the beginning of the reign of Henry VIII. And this, of course, is the moment when there is this sudden, vast expansion of Europe, in which England does not play any significant part at all at this point. There'd been signs under Henry's father, with his backing for the voyages of Sebastian Cabot and whatever from Bristol. There'd been signs that he understood what was going on across the Atlantic, but then of course Henry VII isn't really English, as I've argued before. He is brought up in France, he's brought up in Brittany, again that western coast, he's brought up at the French court and so on. He has those values. Henry VIII doesn't. But the Spanish and the Portuguese are embarked at this point on this extraordinary series of long voyages, in the case of the Portuguese, circumnavigation, in the case of the Spanish, across to Latin America. And of course there you get exactly the same process that I talked about before, with the fall of the Western Empire to Islam. You get exactly the same process. You get the native empires of the Aztecs and of the Incas collapsing to tiny, tiny handfuls of Spanish troops, aided by the fact, of course, that they have guns and the natives don't. But again, it's the fall of one empire before another, the empires being this accretive process. What goes on in England is, of course, very different. You get Henry showing a very powerful interest in reinventing the empire of Henry V, consciously harking back to that, and failing. But on the other hand, of course, Henry's turning of these new ideas, these new approaches to literature and to learning, this back to what's called the sources, ad fontes, going back to the sources. You get him turning these ideas quite cynically, although of course he always persuades himself that whatever he wanted to do was the right thing to do. Henry had been a great defender of the Catholic Church, this sort of imperial church, against the attacks of Martin Luther. He, of course, reverses position completely once the Catholic Church refuses to give him his divorce from Catherine of Aragon, and instead, although he never goes by any means fully along with Luther, and indeed the two continue to hate each other, you get a royal religious revolution in England, which is accompanied, and very important we say this, with many sorts of imperial gesture. Henry sees himself as exercising a combined power over the church, which is like an Old Testament king. It's like King Solomon, Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet, crowned Solomon king and all that stuff. Or it is, and this I think is more precise, it's like the powers of a Byzantine emperor, a post-Constantine emperor over the Eastern Church. He sees himself in that kind of light. And there's also something else, and this is, I've touched on this before, but I've never really developed it in this explicit kind of way, and it was very much the experience of doing that talk on William Cecil that made me think about it like this. I think that the way in which Cecil and whatever start studying Cicero, they start looking at at their Virgil properly, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, sweet and fitting thing to die for your country. The fact that we are all really the equivalent of ants in the great hive of the state, that we all have a duty to the Commonwealth and to the res publica and all the rest. All of these kind of ideas, I think these are the things that help to power this extraordinary takeoff of royal power in the England of Henry VIII, and indeed Tudor England in general from this point onwards. You get a kind of Romanization of English kingship, or rather I think you split English kingship sort of into two. The court, the palace, very much, I think, adopts these kind of ideas, which of course emphasize royal power, emphasize royal majesty, the actual personal will of the king. And it's the creation of all of those instruments of the Privy Chamber, the Privy Council, all the Secretaries of State, all of the stuff that I've talked about before. But at the same time, there remains an earlier notion of English kingship, which is embedded in the institutions of the medieval state. So it's embedded in the much more consensus, broad class-based notion of parliament, in which the king could really, because it's a warrior monarchy, that monarchy fighting in France, it could only really rule with the effective cooperation of the landed elites, and it could only do so through the forms of law and that intense legalism which I've talked about before. And the way I try to express it, and I'm increasingly sure this is the right way to look at it, you've really got two different sorts of monarchy in England. You don't have a republican view and you don't have a monarchical view. You have two different views of kingship. You have this Roman view of kingship, that kingship authorities what the king wants, and then you have this much broader view, which is, well, the king is really due process. The king is a kind of collective, and it's embodied in the two palaces which emerge as the two centres of power under Henry VIII. The new Palace of Whitehall, taken over by Henry from Wolsey, it was originally his Palace of York Place, and then enormously expanded to cover the whole of the area from the river through the Ministry of Defence, across the modern Whitehall and into St James's Park, and the whole range of buildings of the Treasury, the Privy Council Office, and the Foreign Office, and all the rest of them, on that western side of Whitehall. So you get this vast palace complex there that represents as it were, the new attitudes to government, and the older attitude in, well, the old Palace of Westminster, where Parliament, the law courts, the Exchequer, and so on continue to meet. And it seems to me that if you add to that the religious tensions with the Henry, of course, leaving the monarch with this apparently huge increase of power of making him the head of the church, but also, of course, therefore making the monarch, male or female, and making the monarch also, of course, the centre of religious controversy. What religion is going to be is the most debated matter of the time. And what I think happens with the Civil War of the 17th century is these two views of religion, a more ceremonialised church, being, as it were, the Church of Whitehall, and the or the Chapel Royal or of Westminster Abbey, and so on, and that more authoritarian view of kingship, which of course is the only thing that can force that view of religion through, and then a much less ceremonialised, something much nearer to what we might call it low church, even to Scottish Presbyterianism, which is associated with the much broader body of the gentry and the landed classes and the world of Parliament, the House of Commons, and of the Palace of Westminster, and those two moving into conflict with, of course, the conflict of the Civil War. Now, what happens? Well, in terms of empire, when all this is going on? Well, there are these floating notions of empire that I've said Henry isn't very interested in fact, shows no interest in it at all. On the other hand, by the time that Queen Elizabeth comes to the throne, her proclamation is quite extraordinary. It doesn't only proclaim her Queen of England and France and Ireland and all the rest of it, it gives her this vague title as a kind of Empress of the Seas, from the Orkneys to the Bay of Biscay. You've already got this notion, again, we've talked about it before, the way it's Henry VIII who actually changes England into, gives England this sense of difference from Europe, this sense of an island cut off. In other words, that the Channel, which had been this essentially vehicle of communication in the Middle Ages, becomes the barrier, the widest strip of water in the world, as I've called it before. And it's Henry, of course, who creates the elements, the continuing elements of the Royal Navy and its administration, and of course, above all, fortifies the whole of the coast from the northeast, from Hull and from Newcastle on Tyne, the whole of the way round to Milford Haven. So you actually create this sense of an island separate from Europe. And I think that's another one of the vast legacies of Henry's reign, which I think is the fundamental basis of the notion of English exceptionalism. This sense of an island cut off. I'm going to do a whole talk on this because people have asked me as part of the Q&A, what is the English myth? And they talked about things like Arthur or Shakespeare or Chaucer. Well, actually, I think the English myth is different. I think the English myth is the Tudors. I think the Tudors are the mythic figures in our history, and the foundation of that idea of English exceptionalism, of England alone, England holding off continental Europe, whether it is the forces of Rome, of Spain, and of France under Henry VIII, or the similar combination against Elizabeth in the Armada, or again the resistance to Louis XIV, or again to Napoleon, or again to the Kaiser, or again to Hitler. Well, the foundation of that myth, which of course is also going to feed into empire, into a new and different version of empire, that is laid in the reign of Henry VIII. But then it's given, this idea of English exceptionalism is given an explicitly imperial edge through the sea. It's a concept of a sea-born empire, which appears to be born, if you like, at the beginning of Elizabeth's reign, and this whole series of theoreticians of navigation, of like Hakluyt, of mathematicians, of prognosticators, of fantasists like John Dee. They all play round with these ideas of empire, and sometimes it's the Arthurian legends which are developed. It's legends of earlier voyages across the Atlantic, all of them aimed at giving Britain a kind of England. England and Britain, remember, fusing. This is the thing again I've argued. The Arthurian legends from the 15th century onwards are increasingly anchored in England. The Morte d'Arthur anchors Arthur in England, and therefore these legends of vast imaginary conquest aren't seen of as British in our sense of the word British, in other words, incorporating the Celtic fringe. They're seen as an expansion of England, which is, of course, the dominant power. So all of that then, under Elizabeth, taking steps into the real world. Remember, all the schemes of Raleigh's in Virginia and all the rest of them, none of them actually work under Elizabeth. It is under James and Charles, and from that point onwards, the actual turning of these things into reality is the early 17th century. So we've got then this England intention. We've got this England that is putting its feet into empire at the beginning of the 17th century, but it's also an England which is on the point of tearing itself apart in the repeated civil wars of the 17th century, which again, I would ask Prince Charles, does he not think that perhaps one of the what's the word I want? One of the most terrible moments. Let me quote him correctly. One of the most painful moments in our history might actually be civil war. Might it not be the sight of a King Charles having his head cut off? Might it not be what happened in Ireland? What was done to people with white skins and not to people with black skins? You see, this again would be one of the great advantages of this approach that I'm doing, in which we see empire and these sort of big questions as actually being embedded. They don't just suddenly appear. They don't just suddenly appear with one race ruling over another or taking advantage of another. They are absolutely part of the culture. So if we were doing this exercise properly, you see, we'd be able to have that sort of debate. We'd also be able to look at again, the question of most painful moment ever. Well, civil war is pretty painful when you pit family against family, when you don't just execute a king, you execute an Archbishop of Canterbury, you execute the King's First Minister, the Earl of Strafford. Well, all that's very painful. But then, of course, we've just brushed over, haven't we, what Henry VIII does with the Reformation, the ripping apart of 1,000 years of religious history and religious practice. I think that's pretty painful too. The religious struggles of the 16th century, the enemy within, the horrors of torture, the horrors of religious persecution. We've been through all of these, and I think it's really very important that we bear in mind this complexity, that we don't just reduce the past to a single theme, that we don't simply see the past through the prism of race. Would be, I think, a profound distorting glass. Whereas if we look at it through the prism of empire, then Newtonian, we can actually see what light is composed of. That works very, very differently. So we've got then what actually emerges from the civil wars of the 17th century. Well, what I think emerges from the civil wars of the 17th century, in particular, been going on a long time, but it's a big subject, and I'm going to try and stick with it to the end. What emerges from the civil wars of the 17th century is surely a new kind of state in England. It's a new kind of state. It's a more, if you like, a more rational state. It's founded to a key extent on the extraordinary. It's a chicken and egg relationship with the first real enlightenment, the Great Enlightenment, which isn't what goes on, the showy stuff that goes on in 18th century France. It's not even what happens in 18th century Edinburgh. It's what happens in late 17th century England. The mathematical revolutions of Newton, which for the first time lead to a science that really does fully work. And the triumph of the inductive method and the triumph of the understanding of the results of induction via mathematics and the whole world of the Royal Society, and also the new approaches to politics as represented to an extent by Locke, to the notions of contract and whatever that are embodied in the ideas of Locke, to the ideas of the rational management of finance, which are associated with all of this, with the statistical works of people like William Petty, who for the first time accurately measure populations and all that sort of thing, give government statistics to work with, to the creation of rational systems of finance, rational systems of public finance, which depend on that political revolution, the political revolution of 1688-89, which gave the system of you remember I talked about Whitehall and Westminster, which gave Westminster power over Whitehall, which is the kind of collective sense of the governing class, a monarchy which had to depend on that. But then, of course, with the genius of Robert Walpole in the 1720s, that actually managed to fuse the two systems. So you've got the extraordinary office of Prime Minister, which acts as the Commons Parliament controlling the monarch, but also uses the devices and power and particularly patronage of the monarch to manage Parliament. So you get the best of both worlds. You get the ability to direct policy, which you need from, which is given you by an imperial style monarchy, but at the same time you get the machineries of consent, and particularly consent to taxation, particularly the consent of the rich to being taxed, because this is the extraordinary development that takes place in England from the late 17th century. The rich agree to be taxed, and this gives you a rational system of royal finance. And Whereas, what, of course, what had gone on in France at this exact moment was precisely the opposite development. In other words, the opposite part of the Roman inheritance had actually triumphed. In France, you get the creation under Louis XIV of a genuinely imperial monarchy, with the king assuming full imperial control and the destruction of all institutions, or the reduction to impotence of all institutions that don't correspond to that, and the creation of new institutions, the academy and all the rest of it, which are designed to manage art, science, manufactures and all the rest of it, to the single purpose of hymning the glory of the monarch, and increasing his power, and as he is the kind of l'état c'est moi, I am the state, and the embodiment of the state in the person of the monarch. Whereas in England, the monarch embodies the state in the other way round. The monarch embodies the state in the sense of the representative figure, and in France he absorbs the state into his own real personality and real will. It's the opposite take. And Churchill, with his extraordinary genius for understanding these things, why he comes up with, well, why Churchill is Churchill, why he comes up with the phrase the Iron Curtain at Fulton, Missouri, and all the rest of it. Churchill in Marlborough understands the, as it were, the antithetical nature of English government as against French government. And he pairs something else. He points to, if you like, the totalitarian qualities of Louis XIV's government, again very much like the great totalitarians, the emphasis on grand projet, great architectural projects of reshaping geography and so on, and the vast programs of fortification and all the rest of it. But also, of course, he puts his finger on something else: internal persecution of minorities, the attack on the Huguenots, and the driving out of the Huguenots, the bulk of whom take refuge in England, to the enormous advantage in England. So again, one of the things striking about the difference as it emerges between France and England at this point is that in England, as well as this, what I've been describing as this rational culture, you also get a culture of by no means absolute freedom of speech, by no means absolute freedom of religion, but relatively, and in comparison with France, hugely so in the direction of freedom. So two very, very different patterns of culture. And the thing that I think Churchill understands, Churchill writes about passionately, vividly in the Marlborough book, and also in his History of the English-Speaking Peoples, Churchill understands then that what goes on in the 18th century is a duel for world empire between Britain and France. And that duel is overwhelmingly won by England-Britain. Of course, the beginning of it all goes there, doesn't it, really? At the beginning of the 18th century, you get the union of England and Scotland in 1707, which is celebrated by Queen Anne with a magnificent service of Thanksgiving in St. Paul's, along with all those great victories over Louis XIV, which had been won by Churchill's ancestor, the great Duke of Marlborough, Ramillies and Blenheim, and so on, and union with Scotland. So you get these two empires that first fight in Europe, with England, of course, very much as a proxy, and Marlborough being as great a diplomat, again something that Churchill draws a lesson from in the Second World War, Marlborough being as great a diplomat as he is a general. I mean, how on earth do you a British army, which of course is only a relatively small portion of the troops involved, but how do you get a British victory at Blenheim, which is just outside Munich, southern Germany? Think how that actually works, and think of the logistics, and of course, above all, the financial network, the means of transferring money, having the money to transfer, because Britain, because of the rationality of its finances, the fact that finances are anchored to regular recurring grants of taxation by Parliament, Britain quickly starts to be able to borrow at low rates of interest at under 5% and often significantly less. France, because it's absolutist, because it depends on extracting money largely from people who can't pay. That's the poor, because the rich, to a significant extent, are exempt from taxation. France constantly goes bankrupt. So you have constant debt crises, so you have enormously inflated rates of interest, which is why a country of 8 million can take on and defeat a country which is 4 or 5 times the size and with a population of 25 million, which is exactly what happens. So in the course of the 18th century then, and this again is what we need to understand, that you cannot talk about the English Empire alone. It's part of a world complex of European empires. The Spanish and the Portuguese by this point in relative decline, the English and the French battling it out for a new style, genuine world empire. And that victory, of course, is actually won in the 7 Years' War, which Churchill refers to again correctly as the First World War, that war in which the victories of Wolfe over Montcalm in front of Quebec gives Britain Canada, and in which the victories of Clive at Plessis give Britain India. Now here again we need to pause, don't we? Because there's been there's hardly any mention. It's very interesting. There's hardly any mention in all the debate about empire of Wolfe and the victories in Canada, because of course it's, setting aside the native population, the indigenous population of Canada, it's essentially a victory over other white people. It's a victory of the French and the French settlers and the French army in Quebec. So in fact, if you actually look at the famous National Trust account of houses that are associated with empire, General Wolfe's house doesn't even figure, although it's in Westerham, and it's next door to Winston Churchill's house at Chartwell, which of course figures enormously because of Churchill's later roles in India and so on. So it's this notion again that empire is only whites ruling over blacks. Well, of course, it isn't. It really isn't. And most of the time in the 18th century, it's actually whites ruling over other whites, and indeed colonists of the same people, which is exactly the sort of thing that goes on in the United States of America. But let's just quickly pause and look again at the business of India itself. A historian called William Dalrymple has been very much denouncing Clive and the wickedness and the exploitativeness of the British in India. I would like to ask him a question. He seems to be presenting the notion that if Clive hadn't existed, if the British hadn't intervened in India, there would have been, I suppose, Indian independence. I think that's nonsense. The fate of India in the 7 Years' War was it was going to be ruled either by the British or it was going to be ruled by the French, for exactly the reason that I was giving with the fall of the Aztecs and of the Incas a couple of centuries beforehand in Latin America. India had already been subject to a partial conquest, the Islamic conquest, which creates the Mughal Empire. And by the way, somebody who knows at least as much about India as William Dalrymple, V.S. Naipaul, says that it is the Mughal conquest, the Islamic semi-conquest of India, which is the catastrophe of England, the catastrophe of India, unlike the British conquest. But the point that I'm trying to make is the notion that there would have been Indian independence is simply for the birds. The Mughal Empire was in a state of chaos, and its principal line was dying out. It was ineffective. It was fragmenting. In other words, it was exactly that point of the Hellenistic monarchies, of the 5th century Western Empire, of the Incas, of Ptolemaic Egypt. It was an empire that's crumbling and is ready for takeover by another empire. And the only choice, frankly, was between whether it would be England or France. And I think, therefore, one should really ask another rather simple question: which would have been better? And if you want an answer, then I think you need to look, for example, at the fate of an important West Indian island. It was then called half an island, by the way. It was called Saint Domingo, and it's now known as Haiti. And this was the world's densest sugar colony, with, of course, slaves, and it was French. Its history of an attempted independence from France is one of the most horrific stories in the history of the world, and culminating in one of the most dreadful states of the world, which is modern Haiti. There are a series of revolts and counter-revolts in the time of the French Revolution and Napoleon, with Napoleon, by the way, trying to restore slavery after it had been abolished by the French Revolution of the extraordinary native leader, the black leader, Toussaint Louverture, and all the rest of it. And finally, and this is the key thing, finally, it buys Haiti, does get independence. It negotiates an independence from Restoration France. That's France after the fall of Napoleon and the restoration of the French monarchy in the 1820s. But how does it get it? This is the point at which, the British are abolishing slavery. The British are beginning to eliminate, they've abolished slavery within the British Empire. They're moving to abolish the whole slave trade and to liberate the slaves and so on. This exact moment, how does Haiti get its freedom from France? This desperately poor country has to buy it. It pays the French, agrees to pay the French, 150 million gold francs, and it does not finally pay that debt off until the 1940s, when I mentioned this point before. It's actually held by Citibank of New York. That's what happens when you're ruled by the French rather than by the British. So I think, again, we would need, when we were talking about the whole business of empire, to be aware that it's not, as it were, just the British, it's not just the English. There was an actual vast European conquest, vast European competition, and that one might even, ask, who was it better to be conquered by? Because, again, you see, I think this is something else that we just don't really want to talk about. There was no choice. There was no choice. There was going to be a European conquest. This is because you're developing simply a new and superior, in the sense of its command of material. I mean, I'm not saying necessarily morally superior, though I would generally speaking argue that it was. I mean, notions like freedom, notions like security of property, notions like freedom of speech, notions like freedom of religion, all primarily develop in Europe, particularly in England, and that's not in general to be found in other civilizations. But the important thing at this point is simply its power. It's the power that comes from transformed finance, transformed state structures, transformed military and naval structures, and then, of course, resulting from all of those, transformed industrial and technological structures. And at that point, the balance of power lies overwhelmingly in the hands of the West, and particularly in these islands and this tiny area that we call England, which is why this tiny area called England effectively comes to rule the world. And this again is something else that we've just got to address. There was no choice. The British Empire it's the vehicle. It's a kind of fluid that carries modernity through the world. And you've no choice. Even countries, and again, we need to spell this point out, even countries that resist direct, because their own powerful structures, like Japan and China, that resist a direct imperial conquest, have themselves eventually, if they are to survive and they have to keep their own societies and power going, they have to adapt to the new world that has emerged with rationalising, industrialising 18th century England. They have no choice. You get the Meiji Restoration in Japan, you get the much more, well, the consequences of the Meiji Restoration are pretty terrifying if you look at Japan's behaviour in the middle years of the 20th century, or the same kind of process that you see with dramatic horror in Mao's China, and so on. And in other words, they have to do the processes of transformation, of industrialization themselves, and they are very often at least as painful as if they'd been subject to imperial conquest. Right, we've done an awful lot of that, which I hope is beginning to get over. Some of the big debates around that, let's just quickly go back to the whole business of slavery. Clearly, slavery, of course, is monstrous, but of course it is also, it has to be said, commonplace. It simply is commonplace. And England becomes a major slaving power. It begins to become quite an important one from the 1680s onwards, but it becomes a major slaver power in 1714 with the treaties of Utrecht, when Britain emerges from the War of the Spanish Succession, the dominant European power, and it takes over the Asiento from Spain. In other words, it becomes the principal contractor for the supplier of slaves essentially to Latin America, which, remember, is where the great bulk of slaves go. And in the 18th century, Britain is, for that period of time, because it is the biggest and most powerful maritime power, it is the principal shipper of slaves. That fact is not in doubt. But what is to be taught about slavery? Prince Charles seems to be talking about the idea of the transatlantic slave trade being taught simply in isolation. This would be madness, because of course we've talked about, we could go back to the Roman world, we could go back to Egypt, we could go back to Greece, whatever, all of which were, in fact, virtually all societies before mechanization have quasi-slavery, because they depend simply on human muscle and effort to do very unpleasant things, which we then want to replace by machines. So slavery in that sense is a commonplace. The slavery of the 18th century, of course, and has that element of white domineering over black in the transatlantic slave trade. But then, of course, this completely ignores the fact, if we just focus on that transatlantic trade, it completely ignores the fact that the actual dominant, the power that is central to slave trading, is the Islamic world, the people who act as intermediaries between the various black potentates who are capturing rival tribes and whatever and selling them into slavery, are the Arab slave traders in Africa. And there's then another branch of the slave trade, which is the Barbary pirates, the pirates of what is really Morocco, raiding the coasts of Western Europe, including Cornwall, and capturing white people in enormous numbers as slaves. This is the world which is represented by Mozart's Escape from the Seraglio. Is his of course softened and made into a rather pretty opera, but that's the world which is there, and so it's the Arab centre of the slave trade. But what is most important of all, of course, there is the enormous overland slave trade across Africa into the Islamic world itself, particularly into Istanbul, into Constantinople, the heart of the Ottoman Empire. And again, Charles wants the other people do too, they want the transatlantic slave trade to be taught alongside the Holocaust. Now, the Holocaust is, of course, I think, a genuinely unique event. I've already mentioned the horrors of the Norman Conquest, but they do not compare with the industrialized slaughter and the deliberate attempt at the complete eradication of the Jewish people, which is, in other words, it's a deliberate machinery of murder and extirpation. That's what the final solution becomes in Nazi Germany and the vast territories which Nazi Germany occupies across Europe. Is a deliberate attempt at the extirpation of a people, which is what genocide means. The transatlantic slave trade was never that. It was taking slaves who'd been creamed off from Africa by other Africans, sold via Arabs and exported in horrible conditions, as we all know, across the Atlantic. But they were valuable commodities. You didn't wish to lose them. And if you actually look at what happens to them when they go to the bit that's most relevant to the current debate, the numbers who go to the 13 colonies, it's only a few 100,000, 200,000 or 300,000, and what is very striking, very tiny figures compared with the several million that are taken to Latin America, and particularly to Brazil, which is by far Portugal, which is by far the largest user of slaves and so on. But if you look at this comparatively small number of slaves who are exported to the 13 colonies, by the time the 13 colonies become independent, their numbers have doubled. In other words, for the sake of argument, let me say, though I should have the figures in front of me, the exact figures I don't. Let's say 300,000 are exported there. It's 600,000 by the time of American independence. I think that's right, but it's that order of magnitude. And again, when we're doing big questions, ordering in orders of magnitude makes very good sense. So, what conclusion do we have to come from this? Well, is there then no genocide in slavery? Well, actually, I've talked about this again before. Yes, there is. There is a huge genocide in slavery, which is the slavery that goes to the Ottoman Empire. Because there, the men, because they will serve in the seraglio, the places where the harem, where the women are kept, the men will be castrated. And the operation has they're men castrating a man. The death rate is perhaps as high as 90%. And, well, the women, of course, remain fertile, and the Ottomans, the Turks, sleep with them, but the babies have their brains, the mulatto, the mixed-race babies have their brains dashed out at birth, which is why there is no black population in the Islamic world to clamour for restitution as there is in the West Indies, in America and in Britain. It is precisely because one branch of the slave trade was not a genocide that descendants remain to clamour for what understandably amounts to reparations, or another way of putting it, to vengeance. But by taking the Atlantic slave trade in isolation and setting it alongside the genocide, the genuine genocide of the Holocaust, you are comparing incomparables. If you actually looked at the slave trade to the Islamic world, you would actually find something you could compare. But we don't want to do that, or those pushing this idea don't want to do it for the simple reason, why not? Because it is brown on black and not white on black, so it doesn't fit the race narrative. It really is, I'm afraid, as simple and as crude as that. But there's another very, very important point to be made. There is the repeated comparison with the Holocaust and the notion that Germany has come to terms with it in a way which Britain didn't. This seems to me, with slavery, this seems to me to be sublime and absolute nonsense. Why does Germany abandon the final solution? Was there a mass movement in Germany? Were there debates in the German Reichstag? The Reichstag wasn't sitting. Were there petitions by the various churches, well, we all know the Pope was very busy cozying up to Hitler. None of those things happened. The only reason that the death camps are exposed is because, and stopped, and this terrible machinery of destruction interrupted, is because Germany is subject to absolute and total defeat. Germany does not come to terms with its past. The Allies rub its nose in it. That's what happens when those extraordinary scenes of the disgust of British soldiers and officers when they discover what's going on in concentration camps. That's why they treat the commandants of the concentration camps in the way they did. And let's also be quite blunt. Germany does not pay serious reparations. Germany does everything it can to stop paying reparations. The companies that had exploited slave labour sail on regardless, with not a single dent in their fortunes. This, of course, is because the Cold War, the importance of the struggle with the Soviets, very quickly overcomes any notion that there needed to be serious retribution in West Germany. It simply doesn't happen. So the notion that Germany has come to terms with its past is simply a fiction. It is a complete fiction. Yes, there's been subsequently much wailing and gnashing of teeth. Has it produced a particularly moral approach by Germany to another people's struggle for liberty in the Ukraine? Shouldn't we be asking that question? And then compare that with slavery in Britain. At the height of Britain's power, when Britain really did rule the world, it tore itself, not this question of coming to terms with slavery, late 18th, early 19th century Britain tore itself apart. It was fighting Napoleon. It still found time for agonised debates, for campaigns, for huge movements of public protest, for public debate, for taking up vast amounts of time in the House of Commons to debate this issue. And then finally, when you settle on abolition and the freeing of the slaves, granted, you do not produce reparations, but remember, that's a whole world view which is not yet to happen. But what you do and compare it with what happens in Haiti. In Haiti, you have a people that's got to try to buy itself out of slavery by mortgaging itself to the French for another 150 years, right? What happens in the West Indies, wherever slaves remain, and almost entirely in the West Indies, is the slave owners are bought out at huge cost by the state. So Britain does come to terms, but now nearly 200, in fact now almost 200 years ago. In other words, what poor Prince Charles is going on saying, oh, it really is time we bothered to recognise this question. We did 200 years ago. We did not wait to be conquered. We decided slavery was an abomination of our own accord, and we did something about it. And we not only did something about it within Britain, we not only bought the slaves out, we also did it throughout the world. And a huge part of the efforts of the Royal Navy from the 1830s onwards are devoted to, and many lives are lost, to the suppression of the slave trade, in particular stopping slaves being shipped by the Portuguese to Brazil. So the idea that there is this sort of huge unadmitted aspect of Britain's past is simply not true. And the thing that makes it even more absurd, and what is frankly unforgivable by both Prince Charles and by Prince William, is that in 1840, Victoria's consort, the great and by far the most intelligent member of the royal family for probably forever, Prince Albert, gave a speech effectively anticipating word for word Charles's speech. So if we then look at empire properly, if we then look at empire comparatively, if we then look at things like slavery properly contextualize, comparing it with the actual reality of the Holocaust, of the German reaction to the Holocaust, or non-reaction to the Holocaust, if we actually look at the fraught debate within Britain, and it is purely within Britain, there are traces of it in America, but it essentially draws its strength from Britain. There is a moral crisis. It's a moral debate. It's a genuine debate of self-scrutiny. So we've then got, if we did the subject of empire properly, we would have all of that, and we'd do something else, wouldn't we? Although the scale of the horrors of what Mao did in China, of Hitler and Stalin in Russia, can we just gently point out that even America, with much later to address the question of slavery, America tore itself apart in a most terrible civil war, primarily on this issue. That seems to me to be a measure of seriousness. Has there been anything serious in Russia for the horrors of Stalin? Of course not. Has there been anything serious in China for the horrors of Mao? Why do we have these absurd standards that we apply to ourselves and a mere shrugging of our shoulders with others? We are in a global world. We cannot, as it were, have one rule of self-flagellation for us and another of easy nodding and acceptance. And it reminds me, this has all been terribly serious, let me tell another funny story. We used to have extraordinary times at LSE with a man called Ralph Dahrendorf when he was director, and Dahrendorf was terribly Prussian and whatever, and he used to meet us in the director's dining room, this is members of staff, for dinners to debate the future of the school, and the food was hell. And the only thing that you could possibly eat was the pudding. And Dahrendorf ate very, very quickly. And the moment the pudding had gone on the table, Dahrendorf would have wolfed it all down, and you were just picking up your spoon when, ladies and gentlemen, we are not here simply for these sensual pleasures, but to discuss the future of the school. Whereupon the food was removed. Now, if an Englishman or a Scot or a Welshman or a Brit had actually, or even an American had done that, the place would have been torn down. We just shrugged our shoulders and said, oh, he's German. Now, that's what we do. That's what the left, that's what the self-righteous left, those picking holes in our racial policies, do with the rest of the world. They simply shrug their shoulders. Oh, they're Russian. Oh, they're Chinese. I'm sorry. This is a globalized world. If we have globalized standards, we should apply them. Otherwise, we're simply destroying ourselves in a kind of moral myopia. Which leaves us, doesn't it, with the final stages of empire, the struggle with America, the War of Independence. Very interestingly, the University of Cambridge, which has had a reputation for being hideously woke, has actually started to publish rather a lot of sense on the subject of empire. There's a paper, there's an article which has just come out in the alumni magazine of Cambridge called CAM on the work of those specialising in imperial history and particularly Anglo-American relations and so on. And what they point out is, and again it's very important, that empire in the 18th century is essentially, if you think of the heart of the British Empire in the 18th century, it is the American colonies. So the struggle of empire there is of rule over white colonists, so it's white on white. There is the War of American Independence, and followed up by the War of 1812. But what very quickly becomes apparent, and they argue this very convincingly, is that both America and Britain recognise that they are part of joint enterprise of exploitation, of industrialisation, of world conquest. That in a sense, America, from a very early stage. America was the central part of the British Empire. It separates off, but despite the initial hostility, the military struggle, despite the renewed struggle of 1812, the two countries, the two empires, very quickly established excellent relations, and you re-establish the extraordinarily powerful trading bond across the Atlantic. So, for example, somebody like J.P. Morgan, the founder of the House of Morgan and Morgan Stanley and all the rest of it, in the Wadsworth Athenaeum, which is the thing that he establishes in now, where is it, Connecticut? The name has gone out of my head, but there is actually a plaque to him. This is the middle of the 19th century. A plaque to him in the middle of the floor, and what does it say? J.P. Morgan, merchant, Boston and London. Middle of the 19th century. So that sense of an Arab, that sense of a cross-Atlantic compact between the two. In other words, the empire is a global enterprise. The empire is a global enterprise, and it's something else. It's very different from the Roman, and I think the experience of American the experience of American colonization and the American rebellion leaves a profound impact on the British Empire. Again, I've discussed this before, but you get a sense that the independence of America, that struggle, that fight, must never happen again, and that what you do instead is you have the Durham Report, which envisages the self-government and the independence in peaceful cooperative terms of Canada, and then you extend that idea to Australia, to New Zealand. It was clearly on the cards for India. In different worlds it might have been for South Africa, and indeed it was for South Africa. It was for South Africa. Of course, it was the white South Africa that in the wake of the Boer War that gained it, and so on. But there was this idea then of a series of legacy powers. I've tried to put this in another way, in which the British Empire, it's the first empire that actually wills its own end, that sees the creation of self-governing states as its own end, its own to be desired end. That, I think, is almost where we are now. That the legacy of the British Empire is the legacy of the American Empire. It's the legacy of the extraordinary cooperation between in things, and again the Cambridge article makes this point remarkably. It's the legacy of cooperation between what are called the Five Eyes. That's we have to put it in these terms, the white X members of the empire. That's America, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Britain, all cooperate in terms of intelligence sharing, something extraordinarily unusual. And they do it, of course, because they fundamentally share that reformed pattern of values which first emerges in 18th century, in late 17th, 18th century England. They do so, of course, coloured by the different points at which they break off from Britain. So America, again, the extraordinary struggles that are going on in America at the moment. America breaks off from England in the 18th century. America has an 18th century feel. The violence of its law enforcement, the frequency of weapons, the savagery of its punishments, all this is, as well as the extraordinary wealth, the creativity, the flexibility, and whatever, all of this is characteristic of Georgian England. Canada, on the other hand, separates itself in the late 19th century. This is the great age of liberalism. Australia at the beginning of the 20th, with the rise of the Labour Party. So each one of them is a kind of different flavour of Britain, depending at that moment of independence and separation. But together they are the fundamentals of the West. They are the countries that believe in liberty, equality and property. Those ideas first formulated and developed in late 17th century England first given explicit formation by John Locke in late 17th century England. And that, of course, that's the world, that world of liberty, equality, let's get the slogans right. That world of life, liberty, and property, which is propagated, which is spelled out in the post-war settlement of 1945, the hope for United Nations Charter, the hoped for Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and so on. That world of a rule-based international order, which we thought was fully vindicated by 1989, and of course, led to the fantasies and the silliness of Fukuyama, because it ain't shared. It's really only fully occupied by those descendants of the British Empire. So, well, it's a jolly mixed story. It's been a very, very long one. I don't think I've ever done a talk as long as this, and my voice is collapsing. But I want to end, I've been on the whole pretty positive. I want to end on a bitter note. I think it's important one does again. I've been trying to show, the fact that the ranges, I said right at the beginning, the ranges of issues that we have to debate. I want to end on the great catastrophe of British government and British imperialism, which is Ireland. I've never been able to bring myself to study Ireland. It is, of course, a catastrophe, and I think a pretty unmitigated catastrophe. But it was white on white. Hello, and thank you for watching David Starkey Talks. If, as I very much hope, you're enjoying them, why not become more actively involved and join my members club? As a member, you'll be able to take part in the members-only weekly question and answer session, suggest topics for forthcoming videos, and have priority booking for my forthcoming live events. And while you're at it, why not have a look at the store page on my website, davidstarkey.com. There you can purchase t-shirts and other merchandise, buy signed copies of my books, and, if you're feeling brave and a bit flush, even arrange to take me out to lunch. Thank you once again for watching. I look forward to hearing from you and to welcoming you to my members club.